Good evening. I'm Uday Bhaskar. Welcome to Wide Angle. This is a program that looks at contemporary developments related to security and strategic issues, as also international relations and related themes in an objective and informed manner. Today, we look at Ukraine and the turbulence associated with what is unfolding in Crimea. To discuss this, we have two guests with rich experience. Ambassador Debabrata Saha, who was the Indian ambassador in Ukraine till recently, and Professor Gulshan Sachdeva of the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Ukraine and Crimea are reflective of a complex challenge to the early decades of the 21st century. How does the global community accommodate the legitimate democratic aspirations of the citizens of a country, even while being sensitive to the legitimate security and strategic interests of the proximate neighbors? This has posed a very serious challenge, and even as we speak, the United States has moved certain military assets into the region. Russian President Putin has indicated his own determination to deal with what he thinks are the interests of the Russian people in the region, and the peninsula of Crimea is now rife with different kinds of emotions. Gulshan, with your experience as a professor who studied this very closely, perhaps you should give us the equivalent of a summary as to Ukraine, Crimea. It's a very tangled history. Post-Cold War, the Cold War period, World War II, and frankly going back 100 years to the beginning of World War I. So this is complex, but like a good professor, if you could put it into context for us.
Well, I mean, what we are witnessing today in Ukraine, this is a standard textbook kind of case study of geopolitics, what's happening now. And what is going to happen, the outcome of this crisis in Ukraine will have a serious implications for Russia as a great power. It will have a serious implications for EU because it's also want to play a global, bigger role in the global affairs, and for global geopolitics as well as for relations between US and Russia. Now, the whole thing started almost 3 months ago when President Yanukovych decided to abandon an agreement which the country was negotiating for years with the European Union and move towards Russia. Now, for this, for 20 years, what we have seen, the country is strategically so important between Europe and Russia, a big country in Europe with 45 million population, strategically important because all gas and oil pipelines from Russia to Europe go via Ukraine. Now, when he abandoned this deal, suddenly demonstrations started as a result of this. First, they were opposing this deal, and then they started asking resignation of the president, and it became violent. Almost 100 people died from both sides, police as well as protesters. And then when situations became so difficult, then all the international diplomats became active. On 21st February, an agreement was signed, where 3 foreign ministers from Europe, from France, Germany, and Poland, they participated, and the Russian envoy was also there. Under this agreement, elections were preponed, and they were planning to go back to the earlier 2004 constitution, but and many other things. But at the same time, suddenly, what you see next day, president disappeared, and then everybody forgot about what happened on 21st, and then suddenly you have a new interim government. So now there are serious questions. There are questions about legitimacy of the interim government which is at place, because Russia doesn't really want to recognize this as easily. At the same time, there are also problems about Crimea, because now there is going to be a referendum there. There is a large Russian population, Russian majority area, and Russian Black Sea Fleet there. And this historically, culturally, this is a part of Russia, but which was part of Russia forever, for centuries. But now in 1954 it was given to Ukraine when Soviet Union was one country. And then there are also issues about Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is already stationed there, or what's going to happen to that. At the same time, there are very serious internal problems within Ukraine. The problems concerning economy, problems concerning ethnic tension. So all these issues now, and then the whole global geopolitics, the way.
If I could just pause you here, Ambassador Saha, Professor Sachdeva spoke about the geopolitical dimension, but there is also the domestic matrix of the Ukraine, and you were there for 5 years as ambassador from 2005 to 10. So perhaps you could walk us through the internal situation in Ukraine from its post-Cold War emergence as an independent nation to where we are now?
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to this program. I was privileged to serve in Ukraine for 5 years, as you said, between 2005 and 2010, when the fallout of the so-called Orange Revolution was very much in the Ukrainian political environment. During this time, one had a lot of opportunity to understand the people and see what sort of animates them. What one quickly learned was that Ukraine in 2005, for example, had gotten over a bit of the slump that it had fallen into in 1991 when the former Soviet Union broke up. In fact, between 1991 and 2000, the GDP per capita of Ukraine had fallen by almost 50%. So a part of the former Soviet Union, which was reasonably well off by Soviet standards, was no less well off than most of Russia, had suddenly become greatly impoverished in many senses. The following 5 years saw things improve somewhat during President Kuchma. However, when President Kuchma's time to hand over came because of the two-term limitation, there were changes in the air. There was also a change made in the constitution that you referred to, the 2004 constitution, which basically took away some of the powers of the president. It was a presidential system, without doubt it became presidential parliamentary system, and that system which came into force was the system that basically remained till about last year, and there was a constitutional court ruling which basically declared that those changes in 2004 were not quite constitutional, and therefore there was this going back to the situation that prevailed before 2004, which was again a very strong, powerful presidential system. That again, in a country which had tried to move away from a strong presidency to a more distributed parliamentary system, was not very well appreciated. And that, combined with the proximate cause of the postponement, if you will, of the EU-Ukraine agreement that had been under negotiation for a long time. I was there in 2007. I know, in fact, the cooperation between Ukraine and the EU goes back even further, 94 perhaps.
Yeah, soon after the collapse of the former
Soviet Union. It may not have acquired much steam, but certainly 2007 saw an attempt to invest in that relationship with greater cooperation. However, things didn't move quite as rapidly as it was hoped. But over the past few years, you saw the basic agreements being more put in place. However, I think Ukraine was under a lot of pressure from its Western partners to become a part of their, as a part of their
Extended
neighborhood policy, and Ukraine was the most important country that would be included in that process, followed by other former Soviet, countries. My sense is that the question of Ukraine throwing its lot entirely with the West, with the Europeans, did not sit well for many reasons with all Ukrainians, though there were, of course, people from the more western parts of Ukraine which would have, broadly speaking, have been very happy with it, but there were many parts of Ukraine where that was not the case. Therefore, the question of signing that agreement, which was supposed to be signed in November in Vilnius, was put on hold by
and that in turn led to the current turbulence,
which had a lot of expectation from mostly West Ukrainians. That came as a shattering blow to them, which led them to take to the streets, the barricades as it were, in Kiev, and the rest is history.
But Gulshan, on this particular point, would it be fair to say that what we are seeing now is a reflection of the tension within Ukraine between those who believe that Ukraine should align more with the West and the EU, and the hardcore, those who wish to be aligned more with Moscow, and that Crimea is in many ways the flashpoint that we are seeing? Or would that be too simplistic a explanation?
No, I think it's both internal as well as external. I mean, absolutely there are internal tensions, because the eastern part, pro-Russian, more industrialized, the western part, they want to join more the European institutions and NATO. These are internal kind of tensions what we have in Ukraine, but at the same time, I think there are also broader geopolitics which we talked earlier, because for the last 20 years this has been happening, and in one way West want, what is the objectives of Russia? Russia's objectives, which one can see in Ukraine, that they want Russia, all the Russian speaking people within Ukraine are protected, their military assets are protected. At the same time, somehow they become closer to the Putin's project of Eurasian Economic Union. At the same time, West would like Europe to be an independent sovereign country, align more with the EU institutions as well as perhaps to NATO. And when this 21st February agreement took place, and immediately after that, if you can see the kind of commentaries, particularly in the Western world, I mean, immediately many people were writing that the kind of the policy which Russia was pursuing for the last 20 years in the post-Soviet space, in the near abroad, this is what they said is basically the end of that story. And then at that point of time, when this thing was happening, when they were just throwing away this agreement, you see there was a statement by the Russian ambassador to the UN. What he said, it was very interesting. He said, in the West, they simply do not understand what they are doing, or they do not understand the consequences of what they are doing in Ukraine, or they are doing something with which they are going to destabilize Ukraine, which will have implications not just for the Ukraine, but also for the whole Eastern Europe. So in that sense, now again, even, you see what Henry Kissinger is writing now, that we'll
come back to this in a moment. Ukraine has a very special locus in more ways than one. It is the largest European country in a geographic sense. But we'll come back in a moment and pick up this issue about what Henry Kissinger had said. We'll take a short break now and be back shortly.